Welcome back. We've had a little bit of a break, and thank you again to those of you who chatted to me about what you think this club should be. Because actually, after the session, we've done 3 full years since the first lockdown when we talked to John Elkington, our founder and my business partner, on the Green Swans book. So that came out April 2020. So which kind of kicked off this idea of, could we chat about interesting books? And I'm delighted, and you can see she's got the promo behind her, to welcome the brilliant Jane Davidson, who, as I hope all of you know, she was Minister first for Education, but then for Environment, Sustainability and Housing in Wales. And she proposed, and I want to say birthed, was a midwife of this amazing act, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which was the first piece of legislation that really sort of put regenerative and sustainable practice at the heart of government, and the view to these to the future generations that are important but often not mentioned. And she's written this wonderful book that goes into a lot of detail, and I want to dig into so much of it on what happened, what were the challenges, what are the potentials from that, and then we're going to talk about what she's doing now, because of course she hasn't sat still since she's pushed the act through, and since the book's published. I'm suddenly seeing Anna. Hi, Anna. So Jane, welcome. I know you're in Scotland right now, helping another community.
Yes, hello everybody, and thank you so much for giving up some time to have a conversation with me today. I'm in Elgin in Moray in the north of Scotland, and there is a big community event tomorrow when people of Moray are going to look at how they want to create their own regenerative future. And I've been asked to come and talk to them about whether or not there are things that we've learned on the way in Wales that might be useful up here. And what's really interesting anyway is that actually the Green Party is already on this agenda in Scotland. They already have done work to look at putting a bill in place that very much mirrors the work of Wales, but in the Scottish context. So that work, I think, will be carrying on in the context of the new First Minister, because it was announced yesterday that partnership will carry on going ahead. So I'm assuming we'll see no loss of commitment to that particular piece of legislation.
Fantastic. And what's going to be your biggest message to them tomorrow? Can we hear? Box on. I see Paul and Lucy on.
I was actually saying, I mean, I live in North Pembrokeshire, and in order to get here, I've had to drive 4 hours to Crewe in the rain. I then have to get the car parked, which is just a phenomenally difficult thing to do nowadays. You don't just go to a car park. You have to join an app and find the space and, you know, put your timings in and be accurate and all of that stuff. And then I had to wait another 2.5 hours before I could get on to the train at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning. Oh. And then get off in Inverness and then come to Elgin and try and stay awake. And then the whole thing happens in reverse tomorrow. So in a sense, and when I was taken out by my hosts for lunch today to sort of say welcome to Elgin, and I said, I just feel a complete fraud because I don't fly because of climate issues. So I said, you've paid a lot of money to get me here, and all I'm going to say is that actually, if we can frame the way we do things with a sort of moral sense of purpose, if we can take current and future generations into account when we make decisions, either at organizational level or government level, we make better decisions. That's it. It's my fundamental message is that actually we all have to learn how to make good decisions. And I think I've spent most of my life learning how to do that. It doesn't mean that all the decisions I've made are good, but there is a process to making good decisions. And I think if you can get that process right for the organization you're in, for the place you're in, for the world we're in, for the challenges we face, then actually it helps all of us make better decisions. And so I won't be saying anything to the people of Moray about how to do it. All I'll be saying is that actually think about what the framing of what you want to do could look like. And if you can get engagement across all the community on that, and we'll talk in a few minutes about, you know, what we've done in Wales about that in particular, then actually it just gives you a real ability to sprint to the start.
And I was on mute. Yes, there isn't the answer to give, but it's setting up the system, it's setting up the processes in such a way that, especially with the, I guess, the uncertainty, you mentioned organizations rather than countries, but every organization is feeling it right now and are desperate for some certainty. So yeah, really interesting that this decision-making process. I want to come back to that if we can. What I would love is just to start, because we don't know really how many people have managed to read the book yet and how many are going to run out and buy it tomorrow. Or so would you just, you know, I said this was about how the act got passed, but would you just outline the how you set the book out, I guess? What are the main tenets of it that you would like to?
Okay. I mean, I think that I have to start by saying I was asked to write the book.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's a really important distinction, because I don't think I would have written the book, because it feels presumptuous in a way to sort of, you know, put yourself in a story. But Chelsea Green Publishers, who are American publishers and based in Vermont, but are now, and I think they're in about their 5th year now, they're in the UK, and they very much focus on sustainability related books. I mean, often very practical ones around food and gardening and etc. And they came to me, and it was one of those extraordinary circumstances where the person who came to me in the UK, their editor at the time in the UK, when they were just wanting to break into the UK market, was somebody I knew via lecturing in Schumacher College.
Oh, wow. Okay.
This whole business about networking and community is really important here. And when he was asked to put up 3 authors to set Chelsea Green on its way in the UK, and when he suggested my name, turns out that somebody allied to Chelsea Green in the US had heard me talk in Harvard.
Oh, fantastic.
So it was like, oh yeah, we'll have her. So it was kind of like, you know, it's that sometimes I think sometimes the universe aligns. And I think this sort of notion that I'd actually been thinking for a while, somebody needed to write this story because we'd just been given the accolade in Wales that only Wales, of all the countries in the world, has a legal mechanism to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals, and Wales isn't even a member state. And we were told that in 2019, and part of me thought, wow, that's great. And the other part of me thought, that's not good. If we've got 197 or whatever it is members of the UN, and none of them have a legal mechanism to deliver on the SDGs, and they're all meant to deliver by 2030, that's not good at all. So it was actually partly those sorts of things that meant that when they came to me, they came and said, actually, we've asked the Welsh government, actually, we've asked the commissioner, and, you know, who said, well, who should write this book? And everybody said it had to be you. So at least doing it meant that I had the confidence that people were interested in the narrative that got us to my proposing of the act, because for all the people who are on the call, I actually had left government before the act was passed, but I was passionate about this idea that the Brundtland definition on sustainable development, you know, which is sustainable development effectively means that when you make decisions for current generations, you do not compromise on the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And that just seems to me so fundamentally sensible that I actually just really spent my political life trying to do that in one way or another. And it turned out that without the legal backing, it's really hard. So what the book narrates is, on the one hand, my personal story about how I became a climate activist, because I didn't really become an activist until I was really focusing on this work. So from 2007, and the legislative story, which is how Wales started with a duty to promote sustainable development and everything it did in its first Government of Wales Act that set up devolved government in Wales, what's now the Welsh Parliament. But a duty to promote, well, I've done it now. You know, I've satisfied the duty to promote by talking to you all now and saying, I think it's great. But it doesn't do anything. And I suppose the big thing that I was able to put into the mix was turning that duty to promote into a duty to deliver. So we'd already were on the page. People loved the idea that we had a duty to promote sustainable development. And in the first 10 years of what was then the National Assembly, we all put a lot of effort into that. And I describe all of that in the book. But actually, we couldn't achieve things for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it was our own lack of powers. Sometimes it was the circumstances when flooding, foot and mouth, for example, all hits you at the same time. So you've got challenges that all governments have on a daily basis. Sometimes it's about lack of commitment of others. Sometimes it's about lack of ambition. You know, all these things play a part. And I think it was just that each of the things that stopped us doing it made me realize how much more we needed it. Because otherwise, how do you take decisions? You're always taking the downstream decision. So if we look at what the government's doing, you know, now talking about offshoring refugees off the shore of Britain, in the kind of like another cruel and unusual way, in the same way they're talking about just lifting people up and sending them to Rwanda, without accepting any of the responsibilities upstream from the roles that we played. And I think that there's, you know, so if we actually think upstream, we need to always be thinking about not putting a bolt on, a sticking plaster solution, but actually, is this time to revisit whatever it is and actually look at how we can make it fairer, how we can make it better in terms of our current challenges, all those sorts of issues.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, there's so much there.
Anyway, the book, without kind of like, you know, going through chapter by chapter,
it goes through that narrative.
Tell that story, but it's not just my story. It's not I mean, mostly it's other people's words. And what's really exciting is you hear from Michael Sheen in the book, who's just amazing. But I also relate it all the way back to Donella Meadows, who is a systems thinker. I didn't discover her until the kind of early 2000s, but, you know, then reading everything she'd written and understanding that, you know, Limits to Growth, the first version of Limits to Growth back in the early 1970s, she made the mistake that I made all those years later, which is she thought that if you tell people and you've got really strong evidence and you take that to governments, they'll go, oh, thank you. Yes, of course we'll change everything we're going to do now.
Yeah.
And they just don't. And it's kind of like, you know, it's a deep shock. And I hadn't read her. And then when I discovered myself in government in the early 2000s, that actually you kind of like, you show government evidence and it doesn't go, yes, thank you very much. It goes, we don't want to hear from you at all. That we particularly don't want to hear from you because you want to advocate something we're not doing. And it's kind of really dangerous situation that in many ways we're now in, where we don't have the chance to sort of debate how we do things well in the interests of us and future generations. So this is not replacing one with the other. This is not saying that You know, I mean, current government just focuses on sometimes yesterday, not even tomorrow. But it's about, and it's not saying that we have to think about everything just in the context of future generations, but it is absolutely about saying you cannot make decisions that don't also help current and future generations if we are going to have a sustainable world and a sustainable human race.
Completely. I feel like sometimes people try and sell it though, as if that's always going to be a win-win. Yeah, thank you. Sort of pop that on the table, because of course it isn't always. That sometimes people feel deeply deprived if we are making the decisions for future. How do you balance that out without pretending it's always going to be great for current generations when you think about it?
Well, I think I've been, you know, I'm often asked this one, Louise, and I often think, show me a real example where we could take a big decision for current generations that did not benefit future generations. That is a good decision. And I think that's the point, really, because I mean, you know, I'm not that one of the things I'm very concerned about is how in what a limited way we interpret the fiduciary duty in terms of payments to shareholders, and kind of feel and have started exploring with some lawyers about, well, if the fiduciary duty were to current and future generations, then actually it would take away, for example, all the investment of the big oil and gas projects.
Yeah.
You know, so it's hard for me to think of an example where you don't improve decision making by factoring both current and future generations into account. And even where it might be perceived as a negative decision, it might benefit future generations more because it actually might be something that helps them have a better defense against the kind of nature and climate crises that are just galloping down the road towards us. And I remember Professor Kevin Anderson. I first asked him to work with me back in 2007 from Manchester University, and just, I think, guru, hero, because Kevin tells it like it is. And I remember when I asked him to work with me on setting up a climate change commission in Wales as our sort of resident academic back in 2007, you know, he put a slide up at the first meeting of the independent group I'd brought together and said, we have to make 9% emission reductions every year.
Yeah.
Because if we don't make 9% reductions every year now, every year we don't do it, it becomes harder. It's 15% now. You know, it's kind of like, it's so difficult to imagine how we can do some of this stuff if we don't start now. So I'm always looking at how we can start now. And the one thing I would say about, you know, saying it's not all win-win is that if fear moved people, the IPCC report published this week would have us all galvanized. In fact, it's the opposite. So we have to show, and we'll come on to my current work later, but we have to show that there is a vision of a better future for us, our families, and future generations in order to bring people onto that. So the way I have framed the book is I've started off with this idea about, well, what is the vision of what we, you know, where we want to live with and how we want to live with it? And then what is the networking? What's the engagement that you have to enable something to become a real proposition? And then truth telling. You've got to tell truth to power. There has to be a way of telling truth to power. And sometimes that'll be really uncomfortable. But from that, you can learn. And at the end of the day, we have to finish with loving, because we have to believe that there are enough of us who care enough, who will collaborate and work together to try and seek a better outcome for all of us.
Absolutely. And yeah, that's one of my bugbears, that the people assuming that there aren't. And everywhere I go, big companies, government, financial institutions, people on the street, actually people do care, and there is enough love in the world for the future generations as well. Can I pick up, you said in very typical, I've now got to know how you speak, the sort of humble fashion, as I found myself in government. I want to talk about, how did you find yourself in government? I know you talk about it a little bit in the book, but I would love to go even further back, and just, was it always there as a child? You talk a little bit about as you grow up with nature and so on, but you don't necessarily, as far as I remember, talk about that needing to change things or getting involved, and yet suddenly you're there and you're a councillor, and then you're a minister, and it all rolls on.
No, I am absolutely not one of those people who was going to be prime minister from the age of 4. In fact, I struggled not to be expelled from just about every institution.
Oh, what? That's what we now want to know, all of us.
Yep, I did. I nearly got expelled from my primary school. I nearly got expelled from my secondary school. I was actually expelled from my university, and I had to grovel to go back. And it was only because I grovelled sufficiently that they allowed me to do my final year. But yes, now I think, when I look back, I noticed that even in primary school, I was writing recommendations for how things should change. In my particular case, it was about the fact that I hated milk. We had those little bottles of milk.
Oh yes.
Now, I was brought up in, this isn't actually in the book either, I was brought up in Zimbabwe. So these little bottles of milk would get really warm by the first break. And they were, I mean, for my purpose, they were absolutely undrinkable. And I kind of I made some representations to the school that they ought to keep them on the other side, not at the classroom door, because all our classroom doors had sun coming in the morning, and by keeping them on the other side of the school, so I kind of did start this kind of, I have ideas that might improve things very early on. So I did I did go through probably the whole of my life doing things like that. I set up visits to Shakespeare in my 6th form, because my school wasn't very far away, and so it's not all kind of worthy. It's quite self-indulgent. I can only go to see Shakespeare, who I love, and the whole season if I can get the rest of the 6th form to come now. So, but I think the important bit really is that if we look back at our lives, we often find threads. And when I look back at my childhood growing up in Zimbabwe, where my parents went, my father started the medical school there, I see how I witnessed examples of racism as a really young child that have just made me hate racism in all its forms ever since, and not understand it, to be honest. I've never have kind of understood what motivates a racist in any way whatsoever. And similarly about kind of other equality issues, and similarly about nature. I mean, I noticed that somebody's written something in my LinkedIn feed this week about shifting baselines, and the notion that when, now, if the first time you've noticed nature, it's kind of 30 years more depleted than when I first noticed nature, you think you're noticing the norm. And or you only think a few things have gone, whereas I can see whole species nearly wiped out. So there's something about age here that I actually think needs to come back to the fore, and not just David Attenborough, but all of us who actually can kind of say, our childhoods were absolutely full of nature, absolutely full. The stuff that hurt, I mean, sitting on red ants is not to be recommended, but, as well as others. But I cannot remember any aspect of my childhood that didn't involve a very wide range of plants, animals, insects. And I do talk about that a lot in the book, and it's been hugely influential on all the things I did subsequently. When when I used the hedge in school for, you know, to sort of act out Macbeth and Birnam Wood's coming to Dunsinane. And then 40 years later, meeting, I didn't know this was one of my ex-pupils. He had long hair then, he had no hair now, you know, who went, "Miss, the best lesson ever. Birnam Wood's come to Dunsinane." I went, "Right, and what was the play?" And he said, "No idea."
But he remembered that bit.
It was just like, you know, that whole thing about, you know, how you can use nature to inspire.
And you talk
really.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. I love it. And that actually gives us a little bit more than the book, because yeah, I was missing that, you know, petitions about the milk. I think that's a great
Yeah, no.
the and if we hold on to that nature piece for a second, this idea of us having a connection to nature is, at least in my circles, becoming more and more accepted as something we all need in order somehow to inspire us and drive us forward in helping with this change. You talk about experiential education when you were Minister for Education. How are you seeing that that compared to some of the, I guess, the content? So we've got a new GCSE in the UK on natural science, which is great. But is it content, or is it really getting young people and children out into nature and that experiential piece? How important is that, do you think?
Oh, I think that's hugely important. And it's why, yes, I spent I mean, I'm a teacher by profession, and then I suppose and very much an educator by profession. Most of my working life has been as an educator, whether it's a teaching or in college or in university. And I had experienced the curriculum as a teacher, and I thought that the curriculum that we had in the early 1980s when I was a teacher was awful. And of course, this was Thatcher's big proposal about, you know, initially it was about we were all going to learn the same thing at the same time, very Gradgrind Dickens type approach. But I thought it was really important that the things that we value, we have to engage with. So we have to engage children in nature. And of course, some countries do it well. I mean, forest schools throughout Scandinavia. I mean, I've witnessed forest schools in action in Germany in the last few weeks, and just children who are kind of like, you know, really kind of duffled up against the weather. And my favorite headline ever in my whole life is "Minister makes children play in the rain." And it was because we changed the curriculum, so it was all focused on experiential learning, inside and outside. Every school had to have an outside classroom. And I think that this is where you change the frame and you really change outcomes. Because the year before, the representations I'd had from schools had all been about, can we tarmac our grass over? We need more car parking. And then we put the use of nature into the curriculum, and it's where can we get more access to land? And it's literally, I mean, it took a couple of years, but I mean, it was really interesting to see how just doing something from a governmental level that goes with the grain of what people want to see happen absolutely changes a frame for operation. And what I'm really delighted now is this is the first year as Wales pilots a move into a full new statutory curriculum, which actually contains the foundation phase, which is the pilot work I did as Education Minister, and also contains the baccalaureate, which is the other pilot work I did as Minister. So children could learn about Wales, Europe, and the world, and they could learn how to research and project and not just do the narrowness of A-levels. And I'm really pleased that I took a lot of flack at the beginning of all of that for it too radical a change. You know, how can Wales, a little country, stand out against the system? But it hasn't. What it has done is just over the years, and underpinning with that point again from the Institute for Education, we can demonstrate that actually this is in the best interest of children. It's much more like the Finnish model than, for example, South Korean model of rote learning. So, you know, you can, underpinning with evidence is absolutely critical, even if governments don't always listen, because it helps you make the argument to most people. and I'm going with the grain of what people would actually really like to see happen, but they don't necessarily know how to get there.
Yeah.
I actually think I've been incredibly lucky because I've been able to go with the grain.
So that's really interesting, and it comes to sort of, I scribbled a couple of questions down before we sat down. And one of them was, and you may have answered this already, how, you know, handing over your baby and moving from the education portfolio to one that you'd put together on sustainability and environmental housing. How does that feel in sort of as a minister? Because you could tell from the pages how passionate you are, and just now about that education piece. And obviously, you know, your career has been in teaching and so on to a certain extent. So how does that feel? And you know, did you look over their shoulder all the time to make sure that they continued the work? Obviously they have, so it's great.
Well, it was very funny because I mean, I'm sure people, you know, realize, because we've seen a lot of changes of ministers over the last few months, so we see people in and out like yo-yos, and I was the longest at serving. I think I still am the longest serving education minister in the UK, because I had 7 years at it, you know, in that portfolio. But I think what was quite funny about it is we had this brilliant first minister, a man called Rodri Morgan, who sadly has died. And he was, and this is where I have been incredibly lucky, because he's one of quite a few people who have let me do what I want to do because he's happy with the way I do it. And that's I think quite important. It's that kind of leadership whereby you leadership as a facilitator rather than thinking it's you know, not thinking that you actually have to sort of kind of corral and control all your ministers. And I kept ringing Rodri during the election and saying, you know, it's kind of like, I mean, I have to say, I didn't think in any way I would be leaving education, because I'd been in it so long that it was like my job, and I certainly wasn't finished. I hadn't even got to Key Stage 2. But it was, I kept ringing Rodri and saying, we must have a climate minister, you know, and that person has to be responsible for nature, and they have to be responsible for building, and they have to be responsible for energy, and they have to be responsible for food. They've got to have the responsibility for all the main things that cause emissions, and transport as well, etc. So anyway, I was saying this to Rodri, and I didn't realize until he gave it to me that he thought I was bidding for it. When he gave it to me, I said, no, it can't be me, because I'm really not a scientist. I really, and he said, no, but you really, he said, but it was the way you systemically thought about how to put this portfolio together meant I knew you were, I wanted you to do this. So yes, so I spent my final 4 years in that portfolio, but with very few powers. So actually having authority is one thing, but powers, if you're a minister, is critical. And at the point that I left, if you just because people will understand just how big the challenge was. At the point I left in 2011, I had powers to change energy on the ground. 25 megawatts is all I could do on the ground. 25 megawatts on the ground, and 1 megawatt at sea. So had no, you know, we could not do anything quickly in that situation. In fact, the next First Minister put me onto the Silk Commission, where I successfully argued for 350 megawatts on land and sea, which is what Wales now has. It's still not enough, but at least you could do lots of 350 megawatts to actually give you, and Wales is a net exporter of energy anyway. But I think the kind of critical element on all of this journey is actually seeing something that needs solved. I think people have asked me about how I work. It's kind of, well, if I can do that over there, and that over there, and that over there, we'll get something that's better. We'll get a whole that is bigger than the parts, because at the moment it's leaking down those holes, as it were. So I think that's when I now realize I'm a sort of systems thinker, not a Donna Meadows type of kind of brilliant academic systems thinker, but my brain works in that way of kind of trying to join everything up. And so if I feel there's something that gets in the way, I try and get that changed. And that's really all I do.
And
I try many ways to get things changed. I'm always ready. And this is the only advice I'll give, is if you happen to have a brain that works a little bit like mine, you always have something in your back pocket. So when a circumstance arises and suddenly a door opens in a way that it was absolutely shut the day before, you've got something to put into the mix. And that's exactly how we got the proposition through an emergency resolution to the Labour Party manifesto conference, an emergency resolution on long-term thinking.
Wow.
And that would not, and that was just the right time, the right place, that meant I could take that through. And that's the single act without which we would never have had a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. But if you want to know all the things that led up to that, then
we go by the book.
In the book.
I was going to say, we're not going to do the whole book. And just you've got Anna has just popped in the chat that living in Wales with small children, she can absolutely see the benefit of what you're describing, and it feels very different to the experience of friends with children in England. So it worked. The change happened. Thank you, Anna, for posting that. You mentioned just now a couple of times sort of that you were lucky because you were going with the grain. And in the book, there's a couple of I thought really interesting sort of sections where you talk about the intrinsic pressure on a government that's trying to make this big change, and the importance of permission by civil society. And it made me just sort of think about what's the right size, and how, you talk a bit about it in the book, consultations. You're always going out and asking and trying to figure out, are you with the grain? And is that what you're trying to measure? Am I with the grain and am I not? What if you're not? How far do we push it before it becomes coercive sort of environmental policies a la China versus something that has that grassroots backing?
That's a really interesting question. I think it was, I mean, the 1990s and the 2000s was still a very strong period of time. There were a strong 20 years where people were trying to look at how we could live more sustainably. And I think that's the point, that the Brundtland definition, it had been made in about 1987, but actually it really influenced the Millennium Development Goals and subsequently the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that was the grain. And I don't think there was any disagreement from countries in principle. So there was a lot of language used that demonstrated that the grain was good.
Right.
The issue was that most governments, including Wales, were not putting the policies and practice and laws in place to actually enable that journey to be delivered effectively, so that you get the words but you don't get the actions. And I think that's a really, really kind of important element. But it does mean that people like the ideas. And I went through, I mean, there'll be people on this call who will have the similar impatience to me to government consultations. So I don't pretend I was any better than any others at it, other than the fact that I never allowed the consultation to be enough. Because government consultations, often they go out on a dark, rainy day where there's no news. And then it's really hard for people to, all those organizations that are geared up for them respond very, very well. And you know exactly where they're coming from. And what you don't get is anybody else in the mix. And therefore, what I did try and do in everything I did was involve young people, because I set up what was called Funky Dragon then, and now actually has that origin where it has morphed into a proper young people's parliament, which is just brilliant. And I'm working with them at the moment on net zero 2035. But therefore the consultations I did, I also went and facilitated by voluntary organisations. I know that I personally talked to over 6,000 or 7,000 people who are not the usual responders, and that was quite deliberate. So I talked to Merched y Wawr, which is the kind of Welsh-speaking women's WI in a kind of like really rural area, and I went to talk to businesses in a very high carbon infrastructure area as well. So I just went, and I went anywhere I was invited, and sometimes I invited myself, and that enabled us to publish a document which, if anybody's interested on the sort of journey, it was called One Wales, One Planet. We published it in 2009. And that has a vision kind of led by our Climate Change Commission. And I never write this stuff myself. I edit rather than write, but I loved the collaborative work people have done. And I think the important thing, you know, for people in the context of the Future Generations Act is that not only is it the only, not only is Wales the only country that has this legal mechanism, but actually it has the processes as well as the outcomes on the face of the Act. So if you're going to deliver according to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, you have to think preventatively. You have to think long term. You have to collaborate with others. You have to integrate outcomes around the goals, and you have to involve people in the decisions that are being made about them. So big challenge to our public services in Wales, because they all have to do that, including Welsh Government. And then you've got the 7 goals, you know, about making Wales more equal, more prosperous, a Wales of vibrant language and culture, more resilient, which I personally really wish was called the nature goal. You know, looking at the kind of your global responsibility as well, defining communities very simply as I think it's safe, viable and well connected, because that's what we want to live in. All of us want to live in communities that are safe, viable and connected. So it's those sorts of approaches. So all of these are, and then the goal on equality, for example, is, well, how do we get to a position where people can you know, become more equal as a result? And we know equal countries do better, you know, and that's including tackling poverty, but that's about race, gender, protected characteristics as well. How can we make people healthier? Not about ambulance times, but about, you know, what are the behavior changes we need to enable that to happen? So all of this, in a sense, takes the whole debate upstream. And across all the public organisations in Wales, particularly at 3rd tier level, there are amazingly exciting people who now have the permission to think differently and are, you know, basically slapping this down on the face of their bosses, or not on the face, on the desk. Please don't slap on the face. Of course, Wales banned
non-violent way.
smacking. But it's just, and we have seen some big decisions. I mean, the banning smacking, which I was proposing as an education, or actually supporting, promoting as an education minister, we couldn't get through then. Went through easily with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. The roads review, so we're not going to build new roads or big motorways, but we'll improve more local transport links. That went through really easy. The first major universal basic income pilot with our young people who are carers, have come from care, you know, really exciting. And we got over 90% of that cohort in the pilot, and they're being assessed and supported. And, you know, hopefully what we'll see is far better outcomes for that group than you normally see. It's normally the worst outcomes of any group of young people anyway. So all of these things, you're now seeing, this is part of the grain. And actually, it's getting faster. More and more is happening. We've got the 20 mile an hour in all our communities. And, you know, we're just finding that these things come forward. And instead of the normal antagonism. I saw the 15-minute city.
Yeah, exactly.
We haven't had the aggro in Wales on the 15-minute city yet, but I think we might redefine how we describe the concept. But it's kind of like, you know, these ideas are all about place.
Yes.
People, place, community. It is about safe, viable, well-connected communities, because that we all want to live in those.
No, absolutely. And I was going to ask you, and I'm glad, I think it was Paul who popped up the 15-minute city. Have you had any sort of what you'd consider serious aggro or pushback at any, you know, that you go through some examples of what was difficult, but is there anything that was really where you thought, actually, this is almost too tough?
Well, I think when I found out that the civil service had known all along that the promotion of sustainable development didn't need to worry them at all, they never told me, or any other minister, that actually they could just say they were very supportive and do nothing about it. That was a very, very sad day, really, to find out that effectively senior people in the civil service were comforted by the fact they didn't have to
actually change it. Yeah, that's
I thought so. That was probably my lowest point in my part of it.
Right.
And I think the lowest that we're at a very low point at the moment over I pay tribute to my successor. Well, I mean, there's actually been a couple in between, but the first time we've had a minister who has a similar portfolio to mine, and she's really feisty and very strong, and a barrister by profession, so she's very, very good at kind of making the arguments. And she put out an entirely sensible approach about not building on floodplains last year, and all the local authorities jumped on her. Wow. Because it sterilizes development. They all had, you know, massive plans for ridiculous amounts of development on floodplains. And it's kind of like, you know, that we need the insurance industry to step up here. So she had to retreat from that. I mean, it will come back, and it is coming back. It's the timescales are moving a bit, but she will not let it go. But actually, the insurance industry needs to step up here, because they should not be funding any kind of that regeneration, so-called building on floodplains. And I see that other people have the same issues. And it's kind of like, everywhere. You know, everybody knows this.
Yeah, it's just stupid.
And if you look at climate central maps, it's ludicrous. But so this is partly why I just probably so that we let other people in to have, you know, conversations and questions. If I can say a little bit about what I'm doing now.
I was going to say, I really want to, take it to this delivery piece and the 2035 net zero. Go for it.
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, I've taken on a new independent role, not just for government, but for Plaid Cymru, because Labour and Plaid Cymru they're not in coalition, they're in cooperation, i.e. Plaid has not chosen to have any ministers, but they have a serious document that was published at the end of December, and we could definitely put it in the chat if anybody's interested, where they laid out a series of things the two parties wanted to do together. And what I'm very pleased about is if you read underneath what they're doing, each of them is actually demonstrating that they are vulnerable in certain areas because their voters would not like them to change their views on things. And therefore, you know, we might see that, for example, Plaid is more likely to have rural supporters than Labour. And therefore, protection of current arrangements is more important for Plaid as currently than Labour. But Labour is more likely to have big levels of support in the highly emitting industries. So you get my point. Yeah. So each of them has a large kind of area of voter who's got a vested interest in staying in the status quo as for whatever reason. So I've accepted the responsibility to chair a new group whereby we will promote delivery pathways to both parties in order for them to include such delivery pathways in their election manifestos, with their elections happening in 2026. So my group, which is there's a piece published on the Welsh Government website of most of the members. There's a couple more added since then. They're all people who are giving their time free, including me, because we are independent of the political process. So we're giving our time free to create delivery pathways, but in the room is the Committee on Climate Change, Welsh Government, the National Infrastructure Commission, etc. All the key government and other areas that must contribute to what we're doing, they're all in the room as observers.
Okay.
How we're doing it, and this is the exciting, is we're doing it very much like we've done Future Gen. We want to lay out a vision. We want to take evidence on big challenges. And I think our first one is likely to be, how does Wales feed itself by 2035? Okay. So that's every aspect. That's farming, but that's packaging too. That's circular economy. That's food security. That's nature. So it's, all those elements. So we'll go out and we'll consult. And I hope, Louise, you'll help me through Volans as well, that when we get out the challenge, we want it to go out as widely as possible. We'll be asking people to come back to us and say, what would be the pathways to 2035? Amazing. And then we will probably have a small number of people in to give us evidence. We will only be promoting 1 or 2 pathways in every single area. And what we'll be looking at on the back of that is to create a proposition that can go out to be knocked down or supported, and then have some kind of deliberative democracy element in it, which is something that wasn't around when I previously did kind of consultation work, but I really want to get that in, as a result of which everything we do will be tested, etc. I'm sure we'll end up in the national press, probably. I mean, I know that most stuff I've done was been hated by the Daily Mail. I expect this will be too. So I'm sure we'll end up in the national press, often in ways we will be surprised at. But essentially, what we're trying to do is to ensure that those processes I described earlier, is that we are involving people, we are thinking preventative, long-term, collaboratively, etc. And we will be proposing pathways to government, whoever that government is, and it will be for them to adopt them. But we hope that we'll be able to give them such strong evidence in certain areas that actually it will make it impossible to say no. This will be underpinned by academic work from an ESRC impact centre called the Wales Centre for Public Policy. So they'll provide a thought starter paper on all our big challenges. So what I'm hoping we can offer everybody, for example, on this call subsequently, is academically interrogated evidence on what might be able to happen. Put that in the context of Wales, in what would be most likely with the grain and being able to happen politically, and tested on a group of people. And then whatever the governments agree, that then can get costed and modelled. And that all of that as a package will, I hope, start helping others onto this journey about pathways, and not just saying, we need to be here, and we're here, and actually that's a big empty bit in the middle.
Yeah. How exciting. And 2 questions to it. One, remind me the timescale again.
Well, we started in January, so we're just finalising how we're doing this, because the process is as important, if not more important. So to make sure that you're confident about your outcomes. We aim to finish work in July next year. We aim to give government a full report then of all our thinking. But as part of that, the vision that we start off as short will be iterative and will grow as we start putting elements to it from all the elements of emission reduction. And I'm hoping that will help it be a win-win, even though there will be some unpalatable things. For example, moving housing away, people out of housing under threat. And there are those absolutely unpalatable things that governments are not talking about, and they need to. So some things we won't be able to prevent, but we still think that with skills, financing, behaviour change, and others, that we can actually craft a vision of a better future for us all.
Fantastic. Thank you. I want to clap now. And you mentioned you were working with what was Funky Dragon, which is now
the Youth Parliament on the group.
I wanted to hear how that was my second
Yeah.
question. How are you making sure they're involved? Because I have sort of fairly old children who are incredibly engaged, but also say, please don't put this on all of us. This could be, you guys have to figure it out. We're happy to pop in, but this isn't for teenagers to sort out for you lot. So I'd love to hear how you've found.
Well, they're between the ages of 11 and 18, the school part, the Youth Parliament in Wales. They represent the same areas as the elected members, so they have constituency seats, and they are overseen in the Senedd, i.e. the Parliament part of the process, so that it's actually engaging with all of them. And I wanted to work with them specifically because they are in almost like a sort of shadow parliament. They are absolutely engaged with everything that those people who have been formally elected through our democratic processes are engaged in. But they do their own consultations in their own year groups, etc. And I just wanted young people to be consulting with young people as part of this work. So I've tried to build in a number of elements of independence. And if we can build the deliberative democracy bit in, we won't conduct that. We'll have a partner conducting that. And there's a couple of, I've taken part in 3 of those mechanisms in Wales. One which was convened by the IPPR as a sort of test climate assembly. And that was very much coming into Wales, taking a snapshot. One which has been a long process working through Natural Resources Wales, looking at issues around nature. And it'd be interesting to see the outcomes of that, but the community is very engaged. And then there are a number of organisations which are actually using deliberative democracy to achieve outcomes at local levels. So Brilliant. It's becoming a practice in Wales now. And I might also look at different ways of doing it and different challenges so that we actually see what might be better or worse proposals.
Reminds me, we 2 things. What we had Rebecca Willis on.
Becky Willis,
yeah, brilliant.
Yeah. She's amazing.
Exactly, talking about how do you do this, and we need more democracy rather than less. In order.
And her book, you should get her on to talk about her book.
She was here last year. Right. Yeah, no, exactly. And exactly, it was great. It was reminding me, and I can see Anna popped in. And what are the best examples you've seen in Wales? Are they the ones you just mentioned, or have you seen others?
I don't think. I haven't done any analysis, and I think there is an element of horses for courses, so that if you're wanting a snapshot, then you might try a way of working. But if you're wanting long-term engagement, where it helps the community buy into the process, you do something different. So I think there is work going on in academic analysis of this. And one of the things I will certainly be asking the Wales Centre for Public Policy to do in terms of our challenges is to actually talk to us about how best to integrate this in our processes.
No, that's fantastic, because it is that thing. It is process as well as the outcome, isn't it? How we set this up is so important. Can I hop back to slapping people over the heads? Because you'd said in the book at one point, to make change effective, you need to change the culture of how things operate, and that sort of and you alluded to it earlier, that the civil service and the government. And obviously we've seen over the last 5-6 years the UK government having some interesting views on the civil service and what has happened in Westminster, or in and around Westminster in particular. I just wanted to pick up on that a little bit, because presumably that is the culture of operation, is how the civil service operates and the dynamic between government ministers or politicians and those structures. So just what do you think? Are there new types of skills that these people need to have now we're in a different mode, or should be in a different mode? Or those dynamics between, thinking they could get away and not telling you that they didn't need that it didn't need to act.
Well, they've been called out now, haven't they? I mean, they'd never have been booked negatively if they they'd actually tried to help to deliver. No, I think, I mean, but of course, I couldn't have done it without a set of fantastic civil servants who just believed, you know, massively in this agenda. So I think it's probably like most things, but that point about skills, I think, is a really important one, Louise, which is that we don't, in terms of our public services, and I think it's pretty true across the UK. I don't know what it's like in other countries, but the way that we recruit into our public services in some areas is for specialisms. You know, we expect people who are going to be doctors to be trained as doctors. We expect people who are doing, you know, social workers or whatever. But there are an awful lot of roles in public services where you move around from place to place. Yeah. And one of the cultures of the civil service has always been that, you know, you might be in agriculture 1 week, you might have been there 4 years, and then off you go to housing. I don't think that works in the context of a small country, because I think that because that's the only way the civil servant can get the promotion. And I think it just doesn't make sense that people who perhaps are really good in their current environment cannot get promotion in the context of work they're doing, which is really important in the context of delivering on government manifestos. Now, I know that's hard in the context of a small country, but Rhodri Morgan, who I referred to before, Rhodri had this wonderful vision where all the public services in Welsh government will be one service. And we are small enough to do that in Wales. Yes. And I do reference that. I don't talk about it in detail, but I just think that if there was a really healthy arrangement where people moved in and out of government and in and out of different local authorities and other public services, because it's all for the good of Wales, that actually that would be, you know, immensely helpful in terms of actually building collaborative agendas and others. And oddly enough, I've been even more convinced about that in the context of, you know, Wales may not be a big country, but it's really difficult to get from, you know, the four corners. From the four corners of it to each other is virtually impossible. It's hence my having to drive to Crewe to get on the train, for example. Say, so, you know, but I think that the fact that we do spend part of our time you know, we spend part of our time virtually. It doesn't mean to say it all has to be physical. So I'm not suggesting that people need to be removed from their place of work, but actually how we get people to collaborate on just what is the best way to solve bed blocking in Wales. When I was head of health, housing and social care in 1996, that was on my agenda.
Wow. Okay.
You know, sort of thing. So these are long agendas. And I think the skills point, I mean, somebody just put it in the chat, is actually the skills we need now is actually understanding that the skills we have now are not the right ones. So we need to absolutely look about where we take the skills we have now and translate them into the skills we're going to need for future decisions. Yeah. And it doesn't matter to me whether they're called green skills or anything else, because I don't, the trouble with saying green skills is it kind of says, oh, we need those skills over there. You know, it makes it sound as it's only for nature. But actually the skills we need are the skills that will manage climate and nature crises through a just transition and still creating sufficient employment. And that's a very, very hard agenda. And if you've got any ideas,
well, lots of ideas on that one. We can come back to that. As you know, it's one of my things at the moment. The and presumably the pathways will be a helpful guide where some of that skills and not quite retraining, but those skills pathways could.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, no, I should be saying that. So if you can imagine that we have a headline, you know, a headline challenge, something like Can Wales Feed Itself? And we know we need to get that out to a whole load of sectors for taking evidence. We'll have some kind of template which asks people about what can they do by 2035, and also whether or not their answers affect other challenges. We'll put them all on the same piece of paper somewhere anyway, but you know, so that how it influences them as well. But underneath that, we plan to have a series of domains, and I could just not being fully frank about them because we haven't signed them off yet, and it's very, very important that we have that sort of Chatham House environment. But they will be things like skills, financing, behaviour change, contributions towards a circular economy, emission reduction, you know, nature positive, just transition. There'll be all those sorts of things, so that actually we are trying to balance out our trade-offs, because there will have to be some from the beginning. And we need to be explicit about them, because the politicians may take other views in terms of trade-offs. For example, when they come to look at the pathways, depending on their political points of view. So we are trying to take a systemic, holistic approach to a systemic, holistic set of challenges. And they can't be dealt with by any boxes. They have to be dealt with in the round.
Yeah. I saw Paul has just put in that we can have skills with green veins, which
I love that.
I really love. Thank you, Paul.
They borrow that, Paul.
Yes, I'm sure Paul is normally very generous with these things. The other thing, I want to make sure we just chat about a little bit, is you talk a lot in the book about measuring progress and outcomes, which I love, because it becomes very practical to go, so is this working? Is this not? And there's a couple of things that sort of struck me. One was sort of the slightly more theoretical one, I guess, sort of measurement versus action. Because a couple of people said to me, actually, in big business, have said, we're losing all these people from doing good things in businesses to go and measure in banks, because the TCFD regulation means that banks now need to report on this, that, and the other. So they're giving better salaries than companies can, but all they're doing is measuring. There's no rather than action. And I just want to check in with you on the trade-off, I guess. Is there a trade-off between spending a lot of time measuring and spending a lot of time doing? You seem to have struck a really good balance between, you know, checking in and being really aware and on the case with outcomes and what's going on, versus spending too long with measurement or not at all, so you don't get anywhere. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I actually think this is going to be my first real test on measurement.
Okay.
Because if you're going to achieve net zero by 2035, and it has to be about quantifiable reductions.
Yeah.
And, you know, if the UK goes AWOL on this, as we're all very worried it might, then actually it becomes even harder for us to do in Wales. But we will have to have the quantifiable reductions, otherwise it isn't net zero. And I think the other thing is that net zero itself, without actually framing it in the context of just transition, nature positive, is really is actually a really dangerous concept. I just want to get that out there, because we're hearing it now that the UK government, and I know quite a lot of businesses just think this is the way through, is that we will have carbon capture and storage in the next decade, and therefore we can leave it all till that. Yeah. And we can't, because every day we contribute so much more that actually we do have to think about how we support behavior change, etc. So I'm actually at the moment trying to find ways in which we can outline potential pathways that then, if they have sufficient support, we then get costed. And that costing will be costing the earth element, i.e. the emission reduction, as well as the costing, so that, I mean, I don't know quite how we're going to go, we'll talk about heat pumps, but undoubtedly they'll be in our mix somewhere. And therefore, we want to be able to say that in the 10 years from 2025 to 2035, X amount has to be done. You know, because as somebody said, infrastructure takes 8 to 10 years. So we've got, you know, that's why I'm very happy where I am at this moment, because I think that since people understand 10-year planning, that actually we could hopefully get a sweet spot here and say that because we're going to do it by 2035, we actually will have fewer options, because we can't load everything after 2040. Can't make them up as we go along, because they've got to exist now. Otherwise, we can't use them. And anything else is super beneficial. But we have to focus on what is there now. And that's why CAT plays Centre for Alternative Technology plays a major role in this. The Zero Carbon Britain work, which has been led by Paul Allen there, and it's been through 3 iterations now, is always about how you get there, how you get to zero with what we know we can do now.
Exactly.
And that's where we have to start, all of us. What can be done, what should be done, can we enable it to be done? So my focus is absolutely to move from the idea of promoting delivery to delivery. And that's that will continue to be the main thing that guides what I do in my work.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And I'm suddenly looking at time. It's going quite fast. There was one question somebody put in about whether anyone is, for example, tracking, now we're on measurements, the curriculum changes, and have they been delivering sort of mental health benefits as well? So it's a slightly specialist question.
No, mental health has been absolutely incorporated into the new curriculum.
Brilliant.
And I think that if you look at the purposes that underpin the new Welsh curriculum, it is about ethical, informed, happy citizens. I mean, I don't think it's quite that framing, but you know, the idea mental health is absolutely critical here. And when I was education minister, I introduced school counselling, and we had school counselling in all our schools in Wales, and the Welsh government has doubled the money to that. As well, in terms of the whole sort of COVID.
Brilliant and sad that it's needed, but yeah, no, that makes sense. And do you, is there a tracker that you're aware of sort of mental health status of children?
There are a number of global sort of trackers that actually look at happiness of countries, and then there are some that look at issues around children as well. I would think that at the moment we will have a lot of very, very unhappy children, because Wales is the poorest part of the United Kingdom. I mean, I came into politics with all the sort of downturn we had in terms of people's life anticipation, experiences, opportunities. And I don't expect other people to comment, but I mean, you know, Thatcher brought me into politics, and many of my women of my generation, because we saw through the Joseph Rowntree Foundation briefings about what poverty was doing to households. And we're seeing that writ in spades now. I mean, it's just terribly, terribly worrying. So we have more people. There are 40% of people in the UK who are worried about heating and eating. And we have more in Wales. But we also have really strong communities, and communities which really, really, you know, get up and support each other. So I think some of the essential characteristics are there, and that is going with the grain. And every single consultation, you know, going back to that one in 2009 and that phrase about, you know, safe, viable, well-connected communities, it's carried on being the kind of fundament for what people want to live in. You know, they don't want to live in palaces. They often, even when they make a lot of money, they come back to the Rhondda because community wins. But it's kind of like we have the essential ingredients, and you know, kind of in Wales, I think that through the cooperation agreement, it's absolutely clear that both parties really care about making sure that the population can be fed and heated, and wants their partnership on this to deliver. Now, that point about new entrepreneurs is absolutely fascinating, because yes, it has. But not just the act, it's the spirit of it. When I introduced the recycling regulations back in 2009, everybody thought they wouldn't be able to deliver, because I was demanding and squeezing local authorities every year to achieve better outcomes. Now, Wales is now competing with Germany and Singapore to be the best recycler in the world. And had a couple of the Valleys authorities just stepped up by 0.5% each, we would
have won.
Number
Not
one.
that you're competitive at all.
But we're number 3. No, but I think it's, you know, so fascinatingly, when you sometimes hear in the, you know, kind of on the Today programme, which never considers Wales at all, and somebody will say, oh, my authority recycles really well, and you're 60-something%. Is it 60%? We do over 70. You know, so it's but the point about this is that has also created a whole series of entrepreneurs in terms of you know, what you do if you're going to divert from landfill. What kind of opportunities does that create?
And I guess that's part.
Just one other point, just quickly, Louise, on it, which is, and the really interesting, two really interesting things the Welsh government has done recently. One is it's totally changed the procurement mechanisms. So to procure into Welsh government and all the public services, you now have to demonstrate compliance with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And secondly, what do you think is the Welsh government's favoured business model?
Hopefully circular.
What would you like it to be?
I'm saying
circular social enterprise.
Yeah. Which is fantastic.
So all social enterprises. And our new Wellbeing for Future Generations Commissioner is the person who led Compass, which has set up more social enterprises than any other organisation in the UK. So we've just got, this is a circular, doesn't all get recycled in Wales.
I was going to say. So that comes, and actually I'm seeing one question we haven't answered that came a bit earlier, which was about the definition of good, and much of how we assess current versus future quality of a decision depends on how we define good. What I'm hearing is that the definition of good in Wales is shared in a lot of ways, that that vision that you talked about actually has become accepted, and again we talked about going with the grain, that there's a sense that actually everybody knows what they're aiming for. The question I should say is, what's the definition of good and who gets to author it?
Okay, there is no definition of good. I use good a lot, you know, kind of I just love that phrase about what does good look like. And sometimes you know it when you see it, you know it when you read it, you know it when you feel it. But actually every word in the act, and the word the word good is not in the act. Every word in the act actually, in a sense, can be tested through law. Now, one of the things I really like in the act is the idea that prosperity is innovative, it's low carbon, it operates within the limits of the global environment, it generates wealth through opportunities for decent work. You know, so I think that there can be a definition of decent that means that you know that doesn't mean 0 hours contracts and no support. And I think you came, just to finish perhaps with back to culture. Most of my life, we've worked with the definitions of sustainable development that talk about a three-legged stool, if it's slightly disparaging, but it's, you know, the idea about how you balance out environment, economy, and society. Underpinning the act is 4 legs, a great big Eisteddfod chair of an act. It's culture is the 4th limb, and in actual fact it's the biggest one of all, because culture, it's not the culture eats strategy for breakfast, but it does. Culture, identity, heritage has a goal all of its own, but also it's how you bring people into a place in the context of delivery. So it's how you get your culture, your environment, your society, and your economy to reflect the challenges ahead in a way that doesn't damage the prospects of future citizens. In essence, it's going back to Roman Kushnaric. How do you be a good ancestor?
Exactly. How do you do that? One question, and I could see this one from Hannah as well, but I've got one question just to follow on from that, is we're talking about culture, and obviously Wales is a small country. Do you think that there is an optimal size of a country? Have you seen that? I know that internationally the act is being sort of replicated or has inspired other countries. Which ones were they? And do you think how does
it tends to be? I mean, it's Ireland. Ireland is looking to do this now. I've had approaches from Northern Ireland. I've already talked to you that Scotland is on the way with it. There's a couple of provinces in Canada, a couple of states in Australia which are looking at it. The members of the Wellbeing Alliance, that includes Iceland and New Zealand as well. They're very interested in it. And partly I'm here tomorrow to be with the Wellbeing Alliance, talking about the relationship with wellbeing economy and prosperity for future generations. Okay. They're not surprising.
No.
The countries that are interested, and they are small or member states or sub-member state. And I think that does present a challenge in terms of the UK.
That's Hannah's question. I don't know if you can
Hannah's question.
Yeah.
But there is a very, very active campaign supported by Lord John Bird and by Caroline Lucas, which is called Today for Tomorrow. And Lord John Bird has 3 times put up a proposition for a more sharper legislation than Wales. It's got more penalties within it, whereas I deliberately wanted our legislation pretty well to be penalty free.
Okay.
But to have the Commissioner and the Auditor General as critical friends who could call people out if they weren't doing enough. And I'm sure they will be doing a lot of that now that everybody's had 7 years to settle this down. I think the second Commissioner and the second Auditor General who's had this responsibility are likely to be really looking at how well public services are delivering on this. But I think it's more of a challenge in a larger country, because if you don't keep it as something inspirational that inspires people to move into this space, the danger is that we end up back in the sort of tick boxes if you've got kind of draconian elements that then people either have to game or deliver.
Yeah.
So it's, maybe personally what I'd love to see is 4 commissioners across the UK, but the relationship with the governments of the country they're in might be different. Be fine. Because what you'd want is the commissioners collaboratively being able to work for the best of the possible outcomes for us all.
Wonderful. Thank you. And that takes us up to 1 minute. I know we were talking about you reading, but I think we've almost run out of time. We have
I'm going to read something not from me, but from Donella Meadows, which is what I really like to finish with, if I may.
Of course. Thanks, Hannah.
Right. This is in Beyond the Limits. Donella describes 3 mental models to help us think about our behaviour individually and collectively. Only one is hopeful, envisioning a better world. When faced with such a stark choice, what kind of world do we want to live in? 1. The world for all practical purposes has no limits. This model allows extractive industries to extract, and the human economy goes further beyond limits, and the result is collapse. 2. The limits are real, but there is not enough time. People cannot be moderate, responsible, or compassionate in time, so the model is self-fulfilling. The result is collapse. 3. The limits are real and close, but there is no time to waste. Because there is just enough energy, enough material, enough money, enough environmental resilience, and enough human virtue to bring about a planned reduction in the ecological footprint of humankind, a sustainability revolution to a much better world for the vast majority. It's your choice, but when you make it consciously, recognizing that the choices each of us makes will have profound impacts well beyond our lifetimes. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Jane. And that was a wonderful thing to finish on. I'm seeing lots of clapping. I think we should take these off spotlight now. We can see everyone. And
Thank you.
Thanks now. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.